Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. You have requested me, my dear friend, to bestow some of that leisure with which Providence has blessed the decline of my life in registering the hazards and difficulties which attended its commencement. The recollection of those adventures, as you are pleased to term them, has indeed left upon my mind a checkered and varied feeling of pleasure and of pain. Neither is it possible for me to doubt what you have often affirmed, that the incidents which befell me among a people singularly primitive in their government and manners have something interesting and attractive for those who love to hear an old man's stories of a past age. Early in the 18th century, when I, heaven help me, was a youth of some 20 years old, I was summoned suddenly from Bordeaux to attend my father on business of importance. When I dismounted from my post-horse, I hastened to my father's apartment. He was traversing it with an air of composed and steady deliberation, which even my arrival, although an only son, unseen for 4 years, was unable to discompose. I threw myself into his arms. He was a kind, though not a fond father, and the tear twinkled in his dark eye, but it was only for a moment. "Dubourg writes to me that he is satisfied with you, Frank." "I am happy, sir." "But I have less reason to be so," he added, sitting down at his bureau. "I am sorry, sir." "Sorry and happy, Frank, are words that on most occasions signify little or nothing. Here is your last letter." He took it out from a number of others tied up in a parcel of red tape and curiously labelled and filed. "You advise me," reading from my letter, "that in the most important business of forming a plan and adopting a profession for life, you trust my paternal goodness will hold you entitled to at least a negative voice, that you have insuperable, insuperable is the word, insuperable objections to the arrangements which I have proposed to you. There is much more to the same effect, occupying 4 good pages of paper, which a little attention to perspicuity and distinctness of expression might have comprised within as many lines. For, after all, Frank, it amounts but to this, that you will not do as I would have you." "That I cannot, sir, in the present instance. Not that I will not." "Words avail very little with me, young man," said my father, whose inflexibility always possessed the air of the most perfect calmness and self-possession. "Cannot may be a more civil phrase than will not, but the expressions are synonymous where there is no moral impossibility. But I am not a friend to doing business hastily. We will talk this matter over after dinner. Owen." Owen appeared, with the same grave, formal, yet benevolent cast of features which continued to his death to distinguish the head clerk of the great house of Osbaldeston and Tresham. "Owen," said my father, "you must dine with us today, and hear the news Frank has brought us from our friends in Bordeaux." I shall long remember that dinner party. Deeply affected by feelings of anxiety, not unmingled with displeasure, I was unable to take that active share in the conversation which my father seemed to expect from me, and I too frequently gave unsatisfactory answers to the questions with which he assailed me. At length I took courage to speak, endeavouring that my tone of voice should betray my feelings as little as possible. "I am quite aware, sir, how ill qualified I am to play the conspicuous part in society you have destined for me, and luckily I am not ambitious of the wealth I might acquire. Mr. Owen would make a much more effective assistant." "Owen?" said my father. "The boy is mad, actually insane. And pray, sir, if I may presume to inquire, having coolly turned me over to Mr. Owen, although I may expect more attention from anyone than from my son, what may your own sage projects be?" "I should wish, sir," I replied, summoning up my courage, "to travel for 2 or 3 years. Should that consist with your pleasure. Otherwise, although late, I would willingly spend the same time at Oxford or Cambridge." "In the name of common sense, was the like ever heard?" "Then, sir, if you think my plan of improvement too late, I would willingly return to the continent." "You have already spent too much time there to little purpose, Mr. Francis." Then I would choose the army, sir, in preference to any other active line of life. Choose the devil, answered my father hastily, and then, checking himself, I profess you make me as great a fool as you are yourself. Is he not enough to drive one mad, Owen? Poor Owen shook his head and looked down. Hark ye, Frank, continued my father, I'll cut all this matter very short. I was at your age when my father turned me out of doors and settled my legal inheritance on my younger brother. I left Osbaldeston Hall on the back of a broken-down hunter with 10 guineas in my purse. I have never crossed the threshold again, and I never will. I know not, and I care not, if my fox-hunting brother is alive or has broken his neck, but he has children, Frank, and one of them shall be my son, if you cross me further in this matter. I thought at the time there was something unkind in this, and I still think that my father's conduct was injudicious. A more conciliatory treatment would, in all probability, have gained his purpose. As it was, I stood fast, and, as respectfully as I could, declined the proposal he made to me. Perhaps, for who can judge of their own heart, I felt it unmanly to yield on the first summons, and expected further solicitation, as at least a pretext for changing my mind. If so, I was disappointed, for my father only said, Well, Frank, you are nearly of age, and as well qualified to judge of what will constitute your own happiness as you ever are like to be, and therefore I say no more. But, as I am not bound to give in to your plans any more than you are compelled to submit to mine, may I ask to know if you have formed any which depend on my assistance? I answered, not a little abashed, that being bred to no profession, and having no funds of my own, it was obviously impossible for me to subsist without some allowance from my father, that my wishes were very moderate, and that I hoped my aversion for the profession to which he had designed me would not occasion his altogether withdrawing his paternal support and protection. That is to say, you wish to lean on my arm, and yet to walk your own way. That can hardly be, Frank. However, I suppose you mean to obey my directions, so far as they do not cross your own humour. I was about to speak. Silence, if you please, he continued. Supposing this to be the case, you will instantly set out for the north of England to pay your uncle a visit and see the state of his family. I have chosen from among his sons, he has 6, I believe, one who I understand is most worthy to fill the place I intended for you in the counting-house. But some further arrangements may be necessary, and for these your presence may be requisite. You shall have further instructions at Osbaldeston Hall, where you will please to remain until you hear from me. Everything will be ready for your departure tomorrow morning. With these words, my father left the apartment. What does all this mean, Mr. Owen? Said I to my sympathetic friend, whose countenance wore a cast of the deepest dejection. You have ruined yourself, Mr. Frank. That's all. When your father talks in that quiet, determined manner, there will be no more change in him than in a fitted account. And so it proved. For the next morning at 5 o'clock, I found myself on the road to York, mounted on a reasonably good horse, and with 50 guineas in my pocket, travelling, as it would seem, for the purpose of assisting in the adoption of a successor to myself in my father's house and favour, and, for aught I knew, eventually in his fortune also. My mental ruminations, notwithstanding my assumed confidence, were not always of an uncheckered nature, and I should have been reduced to rather an uncomfortable state of dullness, had it not been for the occasional conversation of strangers who chanced to pass the same way. One evening, one such acquaintance and I were about to grace the board of the ruddy-faced host of the Black Bear in the town of Darlington, the bishopric of Durham, when our landlord informed us, with a sort of apologetic tone, that there was a Scotch gentleman to dine with us. "Let us have his company, by all means," answered my companion, and then, turning to me, he gave vent to the tenor of his own reflections. "I respect the Scotch, sir. I love and honour the nation for their sense of morality. I have been creditably assured, sir, by men on whom I can depend, that there was never known such a thing in Scotland as a highway robbery." That's because they have nothing to lose, said mine host, with the chuckle of a self-applauding wit. No, no, landlord, answered a strong, deep voice behind him. It's e'en because you're English gaugers and supervisors that you have sent down benorth the Tweed have ta'en up the trade of thievery over the heads of the native professors. Well said, Mr. Campbell, answered the landlord. I did not think thou'dst been so near us, man. But thou kens I'm an outspoken Yorkshire tyke, and I'll go markets in the south. Even in the ordinary, replied Mr. Campbell, wise folks buy and sell, and fools are bought and sold. This was the first time I had heard the Scottish accent, or indeed that I had familiarly met with an individual of the ancient nation by whom it was spoken. There was much more about him that coincided with my previous conceptions. He had the hard features and athletic form, said to be peculiar to his country, together with a national intonation and slow, pedantic mode of expression, arising from a desire to avoid peculiarities of idiom or dialect. His conversation intimated that he was engaged in the cattle trade, no very dignified professional pursuit, and yet, under these disadvantages, he seemed, as a matter of course, to treat the rest of the company with the cool and condescending politeness which implies a real, or imagined, superiority over those towards whom it is used. Mine host and his Sunday guests, after an effort or two to support their consequence by noise and bold averment, sunk gradually into the authority of Mr. Campbell, who thus fairly possessed himself of the lead in the conversation. So the evening passed, and next day I left the Great Northern Road to turn more westerly in the direction of Osbaldeston Manor, my uncle's seat. From the summit of an eminence, I had already had a distant view of Osbaldeston Hall, a large and antiquated edifice peeping out from a druidical grove of huge oaks, and I was directing my course towards it as straightly and as speedily as the windings of a very indifferent road would permit, when my horse, tired as he was, pricked up his ears at the enlivening notes of a pack of hounds in full cry. I made no doubt that the pack was my uncle's, and drew up my horse with the purpose of suffering the hunters to pass without notice, aware that a hunting field was not the proper scene to introduce myself to a keen sportsman, and determined, when they had passed on, to proceed to the mansion house at my own pace, and there to await the return of the proprietor from his sport. The dogs pursued the trace of Reynard with unerring instinct, and the hunters followed with reckless haste, regardless of the broken and difficult nature of the ground. They were tall, stout young men, well-mounted and dressed in green and red, the uniform of a sporting association, formed under the auspices of old Sir Hildebrand Osbaldeston. My cousins, thought I, as they swept past me. The next reflection was, what is my reception likely to be among these worthy successors of Nimrod, and how improbable is it that I, knowing little or nothing of rural sports, shall find myself at ease or happy in my uncle's family? A vision that passed me interrupted these reflections. It was a young lady, the loveliness of whose very striking features was enhanced by the animation of the chase and the glow of the exercise, mounted on a beautiful horse, jet black, unless where he was flecked by spots of the snow-white foam which embossed his bridle. Her long black hair streamed on the breeze, having, in the hurry of the chase, escaped from the ribbon which bound it. I put my horse to the same pace, to keep in her immediate neighbourhood. The clamour of "Whoop! Dead! Dead!" and the corresponding flourish of the French horn soon announced to us that there was no more occasion for haste, as the chase was at a close. One of the young men whom we had seen approached us, waving the brush of the fox in triumph. They met, and I observed them both look at me and converse a moment in an undertone, the young lady apparently pressing the sportsman to do something which he declined shyly and with a sort of sheepish sullenness. She instantly turned her horse's head towards me, saying, "Well, well, Thorny, if you won't, I must, that's all." "Sir," she continued, addressing me, I have been endeavouring to persuade this cultivated young gentleman to make inquiry of you whether in the course of your travels in these parts you have heard anything of a friend of ours, one Mr. Francis Osbaldeston, who has been for some days expected at Osbaldeston Hall. I was too happy to acknowledge myself to be the party inquired after, and to express my thanks for the obliging inquiries of the young lady. In that case, sir, she rejoined, as my kinsman's politeness seems to be still slumbering, you will permit me, though I suppose it is highly improper, to stand mistress of ceremonies, and to present to you young Squire Thorncliffe Osbaldeston, your cousin, and Di Vernon, who has also the honour to be your accomplished cousin's poor kinswoman. I expressed my gratitude to her for her condescension, and my extreme pleasure at having met with them. To say the truth, the compliment was so expressed that the lady might easily appropriate the greater share of it, for Thorncliffe seemed an arrant country bumpkin, awkward, shy, and somewhat sulky withal. He shook hands with me, however, and then intimated his intention of leaving me that he might help the huntsman and his brothers to couple up the hounds. "There he goes," said the young lady, following him with eyes in which disdain was admirably painted. "The prince of grooms and cockfighters and blackguard horse-coursers, but there is not one of them to mend another. Have you read Markham?" said Miss Vernon. "Read whom, ma'am? I do not even remember the author's name." "Oh, lud, on what a strand you are wrecked," replied the young lady. "A poor, forlorn, and ignorant stranger, unacquainted with the Alcoran of a savage tribe whom you are come to reside among, never to have heard of Markham, the most celebrated author on farriery. But what on earth brings you to Cub Castle, for so the neighbours have christened this hunting hall of ours? You might have stayed away, I suppose, if you would." "Indeed, my dear Miss Vernon," I replied, "I might have considered it a sacrifice to be a temporary resident in Osbaldeston Hall, the inmates being such as you describe them, but I am convinced there is one exception that will make amends for all deficiencies." "Oh, you mean Rashleigh?" said Miss Vernon. "Indeed I do not. I was thinking, forgive me, of some person much nearer me." "I suppose it would be proper not to understand your civility, but that is not my way. I don't make a curtsy for it, because I am sitting on horseback. But seriously, I deserve your exception, for I am the only conversable being about the hall, except the old priest, and Rashleigh." "And who is Rashleigh, for heaven's sake?" "Rashleigh is one who would fain have everyone like him for his own sake. He is Sir Hildebrand's youngest son, about your own age, but not well-looking, in short. But nature has given him a mouthful of common sense, and the priest has added a bushelful of learning. He is what we call a very clever man in this country, where clever men are scarce. Bred to the church, but in no hurry to take orders." "To the Catholic Church." "The Catholic Church? What church else?" said the young lady, then, spurring on ahead, led me my way to Osbaldeston Hall. Before dinner that evening I made the acquaintance of my uncle, Sir Hildebrand Osbaldeston, and my remaining cousins. Sir Hildebrand was a man aged about 60, in a hunting suit which had once been richly laced, but whose splendour had been tarnished by many a November and December storm. The sons were indeed heavy, unadorned blocks as the eye would desire to look upon. Tall, stout, and comely, all and each of the 5 eldest seemed to want alike the Promethean fire of intellect and the exterior grace and manner which, in the polished world, sometimes supply mental deficiency. Their most valuable moral quality seemed to be the good humour and content which was expressed in their heavy features, and their only pretence to accomplishment was their dexterity in field sports, for which alone they lived. The strong Gaius and the strong Cloanthus are not less distinguished by the poet than the strong Percival, the strong Thorncliffe, the strong John, Richard, and Wilfred Osbaldestones were by outward appearance. But, as if to indemnify herself for a uniformity so uncommon in her productions, Dame Nature had rendered Rashleigh Osbaldeston a striking contrast in person and manner, and, as I afterwards learned, in temper and talents, not only to his brothers, but to most men whom I had hitherto met with. His appearance was not in itself prepossessing. He was of low stature, bull-necked and cross-made, and from some early injury in his youth had an imperfection in his gait. His features were irregular, but they were by no means vulgar, and his keen dark eyes and shaggy eyebrows redeemed his face from the charge of commonplace ugliness. But there was in these eyes an expression of art and design, and, on provocation, a ferocity tempered by caution, which nature had made obvious to the most ordinary physiognomist, perhaps with the same intention that she has given the rattle to the poisonous snake. As if to compensate him for these disadvantages of exterior, Rashleigh Osbaldeston was possessed of a voice the most soft, mellow, and rich in its tones that I ever heard, and was at no loss for language of every sort suited to so fine an organ. He was about to place himself beside me at dinner, but Miss Vernon, who, as the only female in the family, arranged all such matters according to her own pleasure, contrived that I should sit betwixt Thorncliffe and herself, and it can scarce be doubted that I favoured this more advantageous arrangement. "I want to speak with you," she said, "and I have placed honest Thorny betwixt Rashleigh and you on purpose. He will be like feather bed twixt castle wall and heavy brunt of cannon ball, while I, your earliest acquaintance in this intellectual family, ask of you how you like us all." A very comprehensive question, Miss Vernon, considering how short while I have been at Osbaldeston Hall. "Oh, the philosophy of your family lies on the surface. There are minute shades distinguishing the individuals which require the eye of an intelligent observer, but the species, as naturalists, I believe, call it, may be distinguished and characterized at once." My 5 elder cousins, then, are, I presume, of pretty nearly the same character. "Yes, they form a happy compound of sot, gamekeeper, bully, horse-jockey, and fool. But, as they say there cannot be found 2 leaves on the same tree exactly alike, so these happy ingredients, being mingled in somewhat various proportions in each individual, make an agreeable variety for those who like to study character." "Give me a sketch, if you please, Miss Vernon." "You shall have them all in a family piece at full length. The favour is too easily granted to be refused. Percy, the son and heir, has more of the sot than of the gamekeeper, bully, horse-jockey, or fool. My precious Thorny is more of the bully than the sot, gamekeeper, jockey, or fool. John, who sleeps whole weeks among the hills, has most of the gamekeeper. The jockey is powerful with Dickon, who rides 200 miles by day and night to be bought and sold at a horse race, and the fool predominates so much over Wilfred's other qualities that he may be termed a fool positive." "A goodly collection, Miss Vernon, but you have not included Mr. Rashleigh Osbaldeston in your domestic sketches." She shrunk, I thought, at this remark, and hastily answered in a much lower tone, "Not a word of Rashleigh. He has been my tutor for 4 years. We are mutually tired of each other, and we shall heartily rejoice at our approaching separation." "Mr. Rashleigh leaves Osbaldeston Hall, then?" "Yes, in a few days. Did you not know that? Your father must keep his resolutions much more secret than Sir Hildebrand. Why, when my uncle was informed that you were to be his guest for some time, and that your father desired to have one of his hopeful sons to fill up the lucrative situation in his counting-house, which was vacant by your obstinacy, Mr. Francis, the good knight held a cour pleniere of all his family, including the butler, housekeeper, and gamekeeper. The reverend assembly of peers and household officers of Osbaldeston Hall was not convoked, as you may suppose, to elect your substitute, because, as Rashleigh alone possessed more arithmetic than was necessary to calculate the odds on a fighting cock, none but he could be supposed qualified for the situation. But some solemn sanction was necessary for transforming Rashleigh's destination from starving as a Catholic priest to thriving as a wealthy banker, and it was not without some reluctance that the acquiescence of the assembly was obtained to such an act of degradation." I can conceive the scruples, but how were they got over? By the general wish, I believe, to get Rashleigh out of the house, replied Miss Vernon. Although youngest of the family, he has somehow or other got the entire management of all the others, and every one is sensible of the subjection, though they cannot shake it off. If anyone opposes him, he is sure to rue having done so before the year goes about, and if you do him a very important service, you may rue it still more. At that rate, answered I, smiling, I should look about me, for I have been the cause, however unintentionally, of his change of situation. Yes, and whether he regards it as an advantage or disadvantage, he will owe you a grudge for it. But here come cheese, radishes, and a bumper to church and king, the hint for chaplains and ladies to disappear, and I, the sole representative of womanhood at Osbaldeston Hall, retreat, as in duty bound. After Miss Vernon quitted the apartment, the bottle circulated, or rather flew around the table in unceasing revolution. I therefore seized a lucky opportunity, and made my escape through a side door to my quarters. The next morning chanced to be Sunday, a day peculiarly hard to be got rid of at Osbaldeston Hall, for after the formal religious service of the morning had been performed, at which all the family regularly attended, it was hard to say upon which individual, Rashleigh and Miss Vernon excepted, the fiend of ennui descended with a most abundant outpouring of his spirit. Rashleigh and I were left alone in the old hall, from which the servants, with their usual bustle and awkwardness, had at length contrived to hurry the remains of our substantial breakfast. I took the opportunity to question him a little. "Give me some lights," I said, "on the geography of the unknown lands." "On which you are wrecked," says Rashleigh. "It is not worth while. It is no Isle of Calypso, umbrageous with shade and intricate with sylvan labyrinth, but a bare, ragged Northumbrian moor, with as little to interest curiosity as to delight the eye. You may descry it in all its nakedness in half an hour's survey, as well as if I were to lay it down before you by line and compass. Oh, but something there is, worthy a more attentive survey. What say you to Miss Vernon? Does she not form an interesting object in the landscape? We're all around as rude as Iceland's coast." I could plainly perceive that Rashleigh disliked the topic now presented to him, but found himself obliged to reply. "I have known less of Miss Vernon," he said, "for some time than I was wont to do formerly. In early age I was her tutor, but as she advanced towards womanhood, my various avocations, the gravity of the profession to which I was destined, the peculiar nature of her engagements, our mutual situation, in short, rendered a close and constant intimacy dangerous and improper. I believe Miss Vernon might consider my reserve as unkindness, but it was my duty. I felt as much as she seemed to do, when compelled to give way to prudence. But where was the safety in cultivating an intimacy with a beautiful and susceptible girl, whose heart, you are aware, must be given either to the cloister or to a betrothed husband? "The cloister or a betrothed husband?" I echoed. "Is that the alternative destined for Miss Vernon?" "Why, aye. Her father's commands, and a certain family contract, destine her to marry one of Sir Hildebrand's sons. A dispensation has been obtained from Rome to Diana Vernon to marry blank Osbaldeston, Esquire, son of Sir Hildebrand Osbaldeston of Osbaldeston Hall, Bart, and so forth, and it only remains to pitch upon the happy man whose name shall fill the gap in the manuscript. Now, as Percy is seldom sober, my father pitched on Thorncliffe as the second prop of the family, and therefore most proper to carry on the line of the Osbaldestons." "The young lady," said I, forcing myself to assume an air of pleasantry, which I believe became me extremely ill, "would perhaps have been inclined to look a little lower on the family tree for the branch to which she was desirous of clinging." "I cannot say," he replied. "There is room for little choice in our family. Dick is a gambler, John a boor, and Wilfred an ass. I believe my father really made the best selection for poor Di, after all." "The present company," said I, "being always accepted." "Oh, my destination to the church placed me out of the question. Otherwise I will not affect to say that, qualified by my education both to instruct and to guide Miss Vernon, I might not have been a more creditable choice than any of my elders." "And so thought the young lady, doubtless." "You are not to suppose so," answered Rashleigh, with an affectation of denial which was contrived to convey the affirmation the case admitted of. "Friendship, only friendship, formed the tie betwixt us, and tender affection of an opening mind to its only instructor. Love came not near us. I told you I was wise in time." I felt little inclination to pursue this conversation any further, and, shaking myself clear of Rashleigh, withdrew to my own apartment, which I recollect I traversed with much vehemence of agitation, repeating aloud the expressions which had most offended me. Susceptible, ardent, tender affection, love! Diana Vernon, the most beautiful creature I ever beheld, in love with him, the bandy-legged, bull-necked, limping scoundrel, Richard III, in all but his hump back. Well, and what is it to me that I should storm and rage at it? Is Diana Vernon the first pretty girl that has loved or married an ugly fellow? And if she were free of every Osbaldeston of them, what concern is it of mine, a Catholic, a Jacobite, a termagant into the boot? For me to look that way were utter madness. By throwing such reflections on the flame of my displeasure, I subdued it into a sort of smouldering heart-burning, and appeared at the dinner-table in as sulky a humour as could well be imagined. Miss Vernon heard me, with surprise, return ungracious answers to one or two playful strokes of satire which she threw out with her usual freedom of speech, but having no suspicion that offence was meant, she only replied to my rude repartees with jests somewhat similar, but polished by her good temper, though pointed by her wit. At length she perceived I was really out of humour, and answered one of my rude speeches thus: "Well, thank heaven and the unprotected state which has taught me endurance, I do not take offence easily, and that I may not be forced to quarrel, whether I like it or no, I have the honour, earlier than usual, to wish you a happy digestion of your dinner and your bad humour." And she left the table accordingly. The next morning she requested my presence in the library. "You behaved to me yesterday," she began immediately, "during dinner, as if something had been told you which lessened or lowered me in your opinion. I beg leave to ask what it was. In a word, let me know what Rashleigh says of me, for he is the grand engineer and first mover of all the machinery of Osbaldeston Hall. But supposing there was anything to tell, Miss Vernon, what does he deserve that betrays the secrets of one ally to another? Rashleigh, you yourself told me, remained your ally, though no longer your friend. I have neither patience for evasion nor inclination for jesting on the present subject. Rashleigh cannot, ought not, dare not hold any language respecting me, Diana Vernon, but what I may demand to hear repeated. That there are subjects of secrecy and confidence between us is most certain, but to such his communications to you could have no relation, and with such I, as an individual, have no concern." Thus urged and encouraged, I stammered through all the account which Rashleigh had given of her early contract to Marian Osbaldeston, and of the uncertainty and difficulty of her choice, and there I would willingly have paused, but her penetration discovered that there was still something behind, and even guessed to what it related. Well, it was ill-natured of Rashleigh to tell this tale on me, but besides all this, Rashleigh said something of himself with relation to me, did he not? He certainly hinted that if it were not for the idea of supplanting his brother, He would now, in consequence of his change of profession, be desirous that the word Rashleigh should fill up the blank in the dispensation instead of the word Thorncliffe. "Aye, indeed," she replied. "Was he so very condescending? Too much honour for his humble handmaid, Diana Vernon. And she, I suppose, was to be enraptured with joy could such a substitute be effected." To confess the truth, he intimated as much, and even further insinuated— "What? Let me hear it all," she exclaimed hastily. "That he had broken off your mutual intimacy, lest it should have given rise to an affection by which his destination to the church would not permit him to profit. There is but little I have heard from you which I did not expect to hear, and which I ought not to have expected, because, bating one circumstance, it is all very true," replied Miss Vernon. "But as there are some poisons so active that a few drops, it is said, will infect a whole fountain, so there is one falsehood in Rashleigh's communication powerful enough to corrupt the whole well in which truth herself is said to have dwelt. It is the leading and foul falsehood that, knowing Rashleigh as I have reason too well to know him, any circumstance on earth could make me think of sharing my lot with him. No," she continued, with a sort of inward shuddering that seemed to express involuntary horror, "any lot rather than that. The sot, the gambler, the bully, the jockey, the insensate fool were 1,000 times preferable to Rashleigh. The convent, the jail, the grave shall be welcome before them all. I do not ask sympathy, and I despise consolation. What I have borne, I have borne. What I am to bear, I will sustain as I may. No word of commiseration can make a burden feel one feather's weight lighter to the slave who must carry it. There is only one human being who could have assisted me, and that is he who has rather chosen to add to my embarrassment, Rashleigh Osbaldeston. Yes, the time once was that I might have learned to love that man, but, great God, the purpose for which he insinuated himself into the confidence of one already so forlorn, the undeviating and continued assiduity with which he pursued that purpose from year to year, without one single momentary pause of remorse or compassion, the purpose for which he would have converted into poison the food he administered to my mind. Gracious Providence, what should I have been in this world and the next, in body and soul, had I fallen under the arts of this accomplished villain? I was so much struck with the scene of perfidious treachery which these words disclosed, that I rose from my chair, hardly knowing what I did, laid my hand on the hilt of my sword, and was about to leave the apartment in search of him on whom I might discharge my just indignation. Almost breathless, and with eyes and looks in which scorn and indignation had given way to the most lively alarm, Miss Vernon threw herself between me and the door of the apartment. "Stay," she said, "stay. However just your resentment, you do not know half the secrets of this fearful prison-house." She then glanced her eyes anxiously round the room, and sunk her voice almost to a whisper. "He bears a charmed life. You cannot assail him without endangering other lives and wider destruction. Had it been otherwise, in some hour of justice he had hardly been safe, even from this weak hand. I told you that I need no comforter. I now tell you I need no avenger. And now pray go. My head aches so much that I cannot join the others." At my next meeting with him, he, as well as I, appeared to have taken up distant ground, and to be disposed to avoid all pretext for collision. He was probably conscious that Miss Vernon's communications had been favourable to him, though he could not know that they extended to discovering his meditated villainy towards her. Our intercourse, therefore, was reserved on both sides, and turned on subjects of little interest. Indeed, his stay at Osbaldeston Hall did not exceed a few days after this period. After Rashleigh's departure, the mode of life at Osbaldeston Hall was too uniform to admit description. Diana Vernon and I enjoyed much of our time in mutual studies. The rest of the family killed theirs in such sports and pastimes as suited the seasons, in which we also took a share. One evening, while walking in the garden, it was natural that I should lift up my eyes to the windows of the old library, which, small in size, but several in number, stretched along the second story of that side of the house which now faced me. Light glanced from their casements. I was not surprised at this, for I knew Miss Vernon often sat there of an evening, though from motives of delicacy I put a strong restraint upon myself, and never sought to join her at a time when I knew, all the rest of the family being engaged for the evening, our interviews must necessarily have been strictly tete-a-tete. But I was a little struck when I distinctly perceived the shadows of two persons pass along and intercept the light from the first of the windows, throwing the casement for a moment into shade. It must be a servant, thought I, whom Diana has engaged to be her companion for the evening, or I must have been mistaken, and taken Diana's shadow for a second person. No, by heaven! It appears on the second window, two figures distinctly traced, and now it is lost again. It is seen on the third, on the fourth, the darkened forms of two persons distinctly seen in each window as they pass along the room, betwixt the windows and the lights. Whom can Diana have got for a companion? The passage of the shadows between the lights and the casements was twice repeated, as if to satisfy me that my observation served me truly, after which the lights were extinguished, and the shades, of course, were seen no more. Trifling as this circumstance was, it occupied my mind for a considerable time. I did not allow myself to suppose that my friendship for Miss Vernon had any directly selfish view. Yet it is incredible the displeasure I felt at the idea of her admitting anyone to private interviews at a time and in a place where, for her own sake, I had been at some trouble to show her that it was improper for me to meet with her. The next day we were sitting together in the library. "Have you heard from your father lately?" she began. "Not a word," I replied. "He has not honoured me with a single line during the several months of my residence here." "Then you are not aware that he had gone to Holland to arrange some pressing affairs which required his own immediate presence?" "I never heard a word of it until this moment." "And further, it must be news to you, and I presume scarcely the most agreeable, that he has left Rashleigh in the almost uncontrolled management of his affairs until his return." I started, and could not suppress my surprise and apprehension. "You have reason for alarm," said Miss Vernon very gravely, "and were I you, I would endeavour to meet and obviate the dangers which arise from so undesirable an arrangement." "And how is it possible for me to do so?" She paused a moment, then answered firmly, "You must instantly leave Osbaldeston Hall and return to London. You have perhaps already," she continued in a softer tone, "been here too long. That fault was not yours. Every succeeding moment you waste here will be a crime. Yes, a crime. For I tell you plainly that if Rashleigh long manages your father's affairs, you may consider his ruin as consummated." A feeling, irresistible in its impulse, induced me to reply, "Ah, Diana, can you give me advice to leave Osbaldeston Hall? Then indeed I have already been a resident here too long." Miss Vernon coloured, but proceeded with great firmness, "Indeed I do give you this advice, not only to quit Osbaldeston Hall, but never to return to it more." "Never!" I exclaimed. "Never! The world can afford me nothing to repay what I must leave behind me." Here I took her hand and pressed it to my lips. "This is folly," she exclaimed. "This is madness." And she struggled to withdraw her hand from my grasp, but not so stubbornly as actually to succeed, until I had held it for nearly a minute. "Hear me, sir," she said, "and curb this unmanly burst of passion. I am, by solemn contract, the bride of heaven, unless I could prefer being wedded to villainy in the person of Rashleigh Osbaldeston, or brutality in that of his brother. I am, therefore, the bride of heaven, betrothed to the convent from the cradle. To me, therefore, these raptures are misapplied. They only serve to prove a further necessity for your departure, and that without delay." At these words she broke suddenly off, and said, but in a suppressed tone of voice, "Leave me instantly. We will meet here again, but it must be for the last time." My eyes followed the direction of hers as she spoke, and I thought I saw the tapestry shake which covered the door of the secret passage from Rashleigh's room to the library. I conceived we were observed, and turned an inquiring glance on Miss Vernon. "It is nothing," said she faintly. "A rat behind the arras." "Dead for a ducat," would have been my reply, had I dared to give way to the feelings which rose indignant at the idea of being subjected to an eavesdropper on such an occasion. Prudence, and the necessity of suppressing my passion and obeying Diana's reiterated command of leave me, came in time to prevent any rash action. I left the apartment in a wild whirl and giddiness of mind, which I in vain attempted to compose when I returned to my own. The next day she stood and came to me directly I entered the library, and before I could broach any of the feelings still churning within me, "Here is a letter," she said, "directed for you, Mr. Osbaldeston, very duly and distinctly, but which, notwithstanding the caution of the person who wrote and addressed it, might perhaps never have reached your hands, had it not fallen into the possession of a certain Pasolet, or enchanted dwarf of mine, whom, like all distressed damsels of romance, I retain in my secret service." I opened the letter, and glanced over the contents. The unfolded sheet of paper dropped from my hands, with the involuntary exclamation of, "Gracious heaven! My folly and disobedience have ruined my father." Miss Vernon rose with looks of real and affectionate alarm. "You grow pale. You are ill. Shall I bring you a glass of water? Be a man, Mr. Osbaldeston, and a firm one. Is your father... is he no more?" "He lives," said I, "thank God. But to what distress and difficulty! If that be all, despair not." "May I read this letter?" she said, taking it up. I assented, hardly knowing what I said. She read it with great attention. "Who is this Mr. Tresham who signs the letter?" "My father's partner, but he is little in the habit of acting personally in the business of the house." "He writes here," said Miss Vernon, "of various letters sent to you previously." "I have received none of them," I replied. "And it appears," she continued, "that Rashleigh, who has taken the full management of affairs during your father's absence in Holland, has some time since left London for Scotland, with effects and remittances to take up large bills granted by your father to persons in that country, and that he has not since been heard of. It is but too true. And here has been," she added, looking at the letter, "a head clerk, or some such person, Owen, dispatched to Glasgow to find out Rashleigh, if possible, and you are entreated to repair to the same place and assist him in his researches. It is even so, and I must depart instantly." "Stay but one moment," said Miss Vernon. "Do not leave this room until I return." She left me in confusion and amazement. In a few minutes she returned with a sheet of paper in her hand, folded and sealed like a letter, but without address. "I trust you," she said, "with this proof of my friendship, because I have the most perfect confidence in your honour. If I understand the nature of your distress rightly, the funds in Rashleigh's possession must be recovered by a certain day, the 12th of September, I think is named, in order that they may be applied to pay the bills in question, and consequently that, if adequate funds be provided before that period, your father's credit is safe from the apprehended calamity." "Certainly, I so understand, Mr. Tresham." I looked at the letter again, and added, "There cannot be a doubt of it." "Well," said Diana, "in that case my little Pasolet may be of use to you. You have heard of a spell contained in a letter. Take this packet. Do not open it until other and ordinary means have failed. If you succeed by your own exertions, I trust to your honour for destroying it without opening or suffering it to be opened. But if not, you may break the seal within 10 days of the fated day, and you will find directions which may possibly be of service to you. Adieu, Frank. We may never meet more, but sometimes think on your friend, Di Vernon." She extended her hand, but I clasped her to my bosom. She sighed as she extricated herself from the embrace which she permitted, escaped to the door which led to her own apartment, and I saw her no more. Taking with me as guide Andrew Fairservice, the hall gardener, who had long been wishful of an employment which would enable his return to his native land, I therefore set off for Glasgow the following morning, and, after several days' travel, arrived in the western metropolis of Scotland on a Saturday evening, too late to entertain thoughts of business of any kind. We alighted at the door of a jolly hostler wife, as Andrew called her, by whom we were civilly received. On the following morning the bells pealed from every steeple, announcing the sanctity of the day. Notwithstanding, however, what I had heard of the severity with which the Sabbath is observed in Scotland, my first impulse, not unnaturally, was to seek out Owen, but on inquiry I found that my attempt would be in vain until kirk time was o'er. Not only did my landlady and guide jointly assure me that there wouldna be a living soul either in the counting-house or dwelling-house of Messrs. McVitie, McFinn and Company, to which Owen's letter referred me, but, moreover, far less would I find any of the partners there. They were serious men, and would be where all good Christians ought to be at sic a time, and that was in the Barony Lech Kirk. I determined to go to this popular place of worship, as much with the purpose of learning, if possible, whether Owen had arrived in Glasgow, as with any great expectation of edification. My hopes were exalted by the assurance that, if Mr. Ephraim McVitie, worthy man, were in the land of life, he would surely honour the Barony Kirk that day with his presence, and if he chanced to have a stranger within his gates, doubtless he would bring him to the duty along with him. This probability determined my motions, and, under the escort of my faithful Andrew, I set forth for the Barony Kirk. Inside, I strained my eyes to see if, among the sea of upturned faces which bent their eyes on the pulpit as a common centre, I could discover the sober and business-like physiognomy of Owen, but no trace of him could I discern. While I endeavoured to make a virtue of necessity, and recall my attention to the sermon, I was disturbed by a singular interruption. A voice from behind whispered distinctly in my ear, "You are in danger in this city. Listen, but do not look back." I kept my face in the same direction. "You are in danger in this place," the voice proceeded. "So am I. Meet me tonight on the brig at 12 precisely. Keep at home till the gloaming, and avoid observation." Here the voice ceased, and I instantly turned my head, but the speaker had, with still greater promptitude, glided behind a pillar and escaped my observation. I was determined to catch a sight of him, if possible, and, extricating myself from the outer circle of hearers, I also stepped behind the column. All there was empty. I could only see a figure wrapped in a mantle, whether a lowland cloak or a highland plaid I could not distinguish, which traversed, like a phantom, the dreary vacuity of vaults behind us, and vanished, like a spectre of one of the numerous dead who rested within its precincts. The day passed slowly enough, but, as the night advanced, I made my way to the place appointed. I began to question whether I had been imposed upon by the trick of a fool, the raving of a madman, or the studied machination of a villain, and paced the little quay or pier adjoining the entrance to the bridge in a state of incredible anxiety and vexation. At length, the hour of 12 o'clock swung its summons over the city from the belfry of the Metropolitan Church of St. Mungo, and was answered and vouched by all the others like dutiful diocesans. The echoes had scarcely ceased to repeat the last sound when a human form appeared, passing along the bridge from the southern shore of the river. "You walk late, sir," said I, as we met.
"I bide tryst," was the reply. "And so I think do you, Mr. Osbaldistone." "You are then the person who requested to meet me here at this unusual hour?" "I am," he replied. "Follow me, and you shall know my reasons." "Before following you, I must know your name and purpose," I answered. "I am a man," was the reply, "and my purpose is friendly to you." "A man," I repeated. "That is a very brief description." "It is all I mean to give, howsoe'er. You may choose to follow me, or to remain without the information I desire to afford you." "Can you not give me that information here?" I demanded. "You must receive it from your eyes, not from my tongue. You must follow me, or remain in ignorance of the information which I have to give you." There was something short, determined, and even stern in the man's manner, not certainly well calculated to conciliate undoubting confidence. We proceeded, contrary to my expectation, to re-enter the town, and glided like mute spectres, side by side, up its empty and silent streets. Our walk was for some minutes in perfect silence. At length my conductor spoke. "I will be frank and free with you. I am conveying you to prison." "To prison?" I exclaimed. "By what warrant? Or for what offence? You shall have my life sooner than my liberty. I defy you, and I will not follow you a step further." "I do not," he said, "carry you there as a prisoner. I am," he added, drawing himself up, "neither a messenger nor sheriff's officer. I carry you to see a prisoner, from whose lips you will learn the risk in which you presently stand. Your liberty is little risked by the visit. Mine is in some peril." While he spoke thus, we had reached the principal street, and were pausing before a large building of hewn stone, garnished, as I thought I could perceive, with gratings of iron before the windows. He tapped at a low wicket, and was answered by a sharp voice, as of one awakened from a dream or reverie.
"What's that? Wha's that, I would say? And fit a deal want ye at this hour routine? Clean agin rules, as they ca' them."
The protracted tone in which the last words were uttered betokened that the speaker was again composing himself to slumber, but my guide spoke in a loud whisper.
"Dougal, man, hae ye forgotten an regrech?" "A deal a bit,"
was the ready and lively response, and I heard the internal guardian of the prison gate bustle up with great alacrity. A few words were exchanged between my conductor and the turnkey in a language to which I was an absolute stranger. The bolts revolved, but with a caution which marked the apprehension that the noise might be overheard, and we stood within the vestibule of the prison of Glasgow. At my first entrance, I turned an eager glance towards my conductor, but the lamp in the vestibule was too low in flame to give my curiosity any satisfaction by affording a distinct perusal of his features. The turnkey trimmed his dying lamp, and made a sign to me to follow him. "Do you not go with us?" said I, looking to my conductor. "It is unnecessary," he replied. "My company may be inconvenient for you, and I had better remain to secure our retreat." I followed the turnkey, who, leaving the inner wicket unlocked behind him, led me up a turnpike, so the Scotch call a winding stair, then along a narrow gallery. Then, opening one of several doors which led into the passage, he ushered me into a small apartment, where, on a pallet bed which occupied one corner, lay my poor friend Owen.
"Gentlemen's to speak where,"
said Dougal, and, turning on his heel, he left the apartment. It was some time before I could prevail upon the unfortunate sleeper awakening to recognize me, and when he did so, the distress of the worthy creature was extreme, at supposing, which he naturally did, that I had been sent thither as a partner of his captivity. I broke in on his lamentations to acquaint him that I was no prisoner, though scarce able to account for my being in that place at such an hour,
I could only silence his inquiries by persisting in those which his own situation suggested, and at length obtained from him such information as he was able to give me. The sum of it was that of 2 correspondents of my father's firm at Glasgow, where he transacted a great deal of business, both my father and Owen had found the house of McVitie, McFinn and Company the most obliging and accommodating. They had deferred to the great English house on every possible occasion, and in their bargains and transactions acted, without repining, the part of the jackal, who only claims what the lion is pleased to leave him. But my father, perhaps suspicious of this excessive deference, had uniformly resisted their desire to become his sole agents in Scotland. On the contrary, he transacted many affairs through a correspondent of a character perfectly different, a man whose good opinion of himself amounted to self-conceit, and who, disliking the English in general as much as my father did the Scotch, would hold no communication but on a footing of absolute equality. As these peculiarities of temper rendered it difficult to transact business with Mr. Nicol Jarvie, you cannot be surprised that Owen threw at all times the weight of his influence in favour of the civil, discreet, accommodating concern of McVitie and McFinn, and spoke of Jarvie as a petulant, conceited Scotch pedlar with whom there was no dealing. It was also not surprising that Owen, in the difficulties to which the house was reduced by the absence of my father and the disappearance of Rashleigh, should, on his arrival in Scotland, which took place 2 days before mine, have recourse to the friendship of those correspondents who had always professed themselves obliged, gratified, and devoted to the service of his principal. They met Owen's request of countenance and assistance with a counter-demand of instant security against imminent hazard of eventual loss, and at length, speaking more plainly, required that a deposit as assets, destined for other purposes, should be placed in their hands for that purpose. Owen had a small share, as I believe is usual, in the house to which he acted as head clerk, and was therefore personally liable for all its obligations. This was known to Messrs. McVitie and McFinn, and with a view of making him feel their power, or rather in order to force him at this emergency into those measures in their favour to which he had expressed himself so repugnant, they had recourse to a summary process of arrest and imprisonment, which, it seems, the law of Scotland, therein surely liable to much abuse, allows to a creditor who finds his conscience at liberty to make oath that the debtor meditates departing from the realm. In the midst of our mingled sorrow, we were disturbed and surprised by a loud knocking at the outward door of the prison. While Dougal, unwillingly, and with as much delay as possible, undid the various fastenings to give admittance to those without, my guide ascended the winding stair and sprang into Owen's apartment. He cast his eyes hastily round, as if looking for a place of concealment, then said to me, "Lend me your pistols. Yet it's no matter, I can do without them. Whatever you see, take no heed, and do not mix your hand in another man's feud. This gear's mine, and I must manage it as I dow. But I have been as hard bested and worse than I am even now." It was a period of awful suspense betwixt the opening of the outward gate and that of the door of the apartment, when there appeared no guard with bayonets fixed, or watch with clubs, bills, or partisans, but a good-looking young woman, with grogram petticoats, holding a lantern in her hand. This female ushered in a more important personage, in form stout, short, and somewhat corpulent, and by dignity, as it soon appeared, a magistrate, bob-wigged, bustling, and breathless with peevish impatience. My conductor, at his appearance, drew back as if to escape observation, but he could not elude the penetrating twinkle with which this dignitary reconnoitred the whole apartment. "A bonny thing it is, and a beseeming, that I should be kept at the door half an hour, Captain Stanchels," said he, addressing the principal jailer, who now showed himself at the door as if in attendance on the great man. "And how's this? Strangers in the jail after lock-up hours, and on the Sabbath evening? I shall look after this, Stanchels, you may depend on't. Keep the door locked, and I'll speak to these gentlemen in a gluffing.
But first, I'm in hae a crack wi' an old acquaintance here. Mr. Owen, Mr. Owen, how's are we, man?
Pretty well in body, I thank you, Mr. Jarvey, drawled out poor Owen, but sore afflicted in spirit.
Nae doot. Aye. That's enough for Whummel. And for ane that held his head sae high, too. Human nature, aye. There are subjects to a down come. But cheer up, Aglyff. D'ye think I would have come doot at 12 o'clock at night, and almost broken the Lord's day, just to tell a fine man o' his backslidings? Nah, that's no Bailey Jarvey's gait, nor was't his worthy father's a deacon afore him. Now, sir, if ye can find caution, judicio sisti, that is, that ye winna flee the country, but appear and relieve your caution when called for in our legal courts, ye may be set at liberty this very morning.
Mr. Jarvey, said Owen, if any friend would become surety for me to that effect, my liberty might be usefully employed, doubtless, both for the house and all connected with it.
"Ah, well, Mr. Owen," resumed the citizen of Glasgow, "I'm a prudent man, as my father the deacon was before me, but rather than an honest, civil gentleman that understands business and is willing to do justice to all men should lie by the heels this gate, unable to help himself or anybody else, why, conscience, man, I'll be your bail mysel. We's hae your legs loose by breakfast time. And now, let's hear what their chammer chiels of yours hae to say for themselves, or how, in the name of unrule, they got here at this time o' night."
The magistrate took the light out of his servant-maid's hand and advanced to his scrutiny. The first whom he approached was my mysterious guide.
"Eh? Ooh!" exclaimed the bailey. "My conscience, it's impossible! And yet, no! Conscience, it canna be! And yet again, deal hae me that I should say so! Ye robber! Ye cateran! Ye born devil that ye are, to our bad ends and nae good een! Can this be you?"
"E'en as you see, bailey," was the laconic answer.
"Conscience! If I amna clean bombazed! You, ye cheek-a-widdy rogue! You, here on your venture in a tall booth of Glasgow! But tell o'er your sins and prepare ye, for if I say the word—"
"True, bailey," said he who was thus addressed, folding his hands behind him with the utmost nonchalance, "but you will never say that word."
"And why should I not, sir?"
exclaimed the magistrate.
"Why should I not? Answer me that! Why should I not?"
"For 3 sufficient reasons, Bailey Jarvey. First, for auld lang syne. Second, for sake of the auld wife ayont the fire at Stuckavralachan, that made some mixture of our bloods, to my own proper shame be it spoken. And lastly, bailey, because if I saw a sign of your betraying me, I would plaster that war with your hands, ere the hand of man could rescue you."
Well, said Mr. Jarvey, "blood's thicker than water, and it lies now in kith, kin, and ally to see motes in ilk other's een, if other een see them no. You're a daring villain, Rob, and you'll be hanged. That will be seen and heard tell o'. But I's and there be the ill bird and foul manest, set apart strong necessity in the screch of duty, which no man should hear and be inobedient. But why the devil's this?" he continued, turning to me. "Some gull ravager that ye hae listed, I dare say."
"This, good Mr. Jarvey," said Owen, "is young Mr. Frank Osbaldeston, the only child of the head of our house, who should have been taken into our firm at the time Mr. Rashleigh Osbaldeston, his cousin, had the luck to be taken into it."
"Oh, I have heard of that snake,"
said the Scotch merchant, interrupting him.
"It is he whom your principal, like an obstinate old fool, would mak a merchant o, wad he or wad he no?" And the lad turned a strolling stage player in pure dislike to the labour an honest man should live by.
"I don't deserve your taunt," I replied. "My dislike of the commercial profession is a feeling of which I am the best and sole judge."
"I protest," said Rob. "I had some respect for this callant even before I kenned what was in him. But now I honour him for his contempt of weavers and spinners and sic like mechanical persons and their pursuits. Will his stage plays and his poetries procure him £5,000 to answer the bills which fall due 10 days hence?"
10 days, I answered, and instinctively drew out Diana Vernon's packet, and the time being elapsed, during which I was to keep the seal sacred, I hastily broke it open. A sealed letter fell from a blank enclosure. A slight current of wind wafted the letter to Mr. Jarvie's feet, who lifted it, examined the address with unceremonious curiosity, and, to my astonishment, handed it to his Highland kinsman, saying,
"Here's a wind has blown a letter to its right owner, though there were 10,000 chances against its coming to hand."